next speaker comes to us this morning from New York, where surprisingly it is snowier than it is in South Bend. So he may vacation in South Bend for a few days. We're glad to have him here. Harris Diamond serves as Chief Executive Officer of the Constituency Management Group of the Interpublic Group of Companies. The group includes IPG companies in the areas of public relations, public affairs, sports and entertainment marketing, corporate and brand identity, and experiential marketing. CMG companies include, among others, DeVries Public Relations, Future Brand, Golan Harris, Jack Morton Worldwide, MWW Group, Octagon, Rogers & Cowan, and Weber Shandwick. They provide services on 6 continents in more than 60 major cities and have approximately 5,000 employees. Mr. Diamond is also Chief Executive Officer of Weber Shandwick, the world's leading public relations firm. As part of this role, he provides high-level strategic communication counsel to an array of clients. Under his direction, the firm has received numerous industry honors and accolades for its work, including being named the 2009 Global Agency of the Year by the Holmes Report. Mr. Diamond was named as one of the 100 most influential public relations people of the 20th century by PR Week. He speaks regularly on leadership reputation and other categories around the world and has lectured at the Annenberg School for Communication and a couple of other business schools, including Wharton and Harvard. Previously, he has served as a political campaign consultant, working on U.S. gubernatorial and senatorial campaigns, and advising foreign governments and political parties. He has held senior positions in the public sector. Mr. Diamond holds both MBA and JD degrees and is a member of the New York State Bar. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Harris Diamond.
Thanks. I want you to know that your professor here has not lost the ability of persuasion himself as he tried to convince me that this is a wonderful resort that I should plan to spend the next 3 or 4 days in. I took a walk last night to the grotto. With all due respect, I'm headed back to New York. I'm really delighted to be here at Notre Dame, take part in your ongoing lecture series. Though I got to admit, I approached the speech with a little bit of a mixture of wonder and apprehension. The wonder was sort of caused by asking what I had done to earn a trip to South Bend in the beautiful month of February. The apprehension was caused by the theme of the lecture series, 10 years hence. In today's communications environment, people who make predictions about what the world is going to look like in a decade from now have a tendency not to be looked upon in the future as prophets. Think back to February 2000. No iPods, no iPhones, no iPads, Facebook, Twitter, Blackberries. No one would have predicted those. And changes they have wrought? So why even think about what lies in store for the next 10 years? Still, you asked for a prediction, so I'm going to make one. First, and this is where I'll focus today, the practice of journalism is going to continue its evolution. But the business of journalism is going to continue having a revolution. And technology will unlikely have more of an impact than it already has, but it will most likely destroy the current business model by which we get most of the information we receive. Those changes raise difficult questions for the functioning of our democracy and economic system as we know them today. Of course, I don't have a crystal ball, and so speculating about the future is mere speculation. But I do know something about the past and the present, and that's the basis for my predictions. First, let's look briefly at journalism. One of my favorite quotes comes from the French philosopher Voltaire. For those of you who might not have been as aware, he was a blogger of sorts in France a few centuries ago. He said that history never repeats itself, but man always does. Those words are true today as they were in the 18th century. Journalism's past and the impact it had on business and society wasn't as glorious as we think, and the future is not going to be as bad as we fear. I hope when we get to the Q&A session, we'll spend some time in that area. But today, with all the hand-wringing that's going on about the dumbing down and sensationalizing of the media, the ugliness of our public discourse, and the consequence that has for markets and our democratic institutions, we have to put it into some type of context. We're living, we are told, through the greatest communications revolution since Gutenberg invented the printing press more than 500 years ago. Now, naturally, revolutions bring revolutionary change, and we're certainly living through that now as newspapers fold, blogs rise, and a cacophony of voices is raised, silenced, or amplified with stunning quickness. People we have never heard of, with little or no professional or institutional backgrounds, have become noted commentators, appearing on talk shows as experts because of their ability to attract attention by the blogs they write or columns they offer. The traditional experts, people who actually work in the field, spent a lifetime developing their knowledge, are slowly but surely disappearing from the public arena, mostly because of their unwillingness to make every discussion a debate, and one that they realize more than anybody else, a debate that usually requires both sides to be listened to. Today, unfortunately, journalism has basically evolved into a he said, she said profession, rather than just a facts mentality, which it was just 30 years ago. We look now for those who will raise their voices the loudest, but not necessarily those who will listen the most. And that is what our journalists are basically writing, reporting, and listening to. Now, with all of that said, and with all the fear that that is spawning, and it's obvious when you watch television nightly and listen to the commentators as they bemoan the loss of sort of our ability to have conversation and decide great weighty matters, in many respects, it's just a repeat of the past. The invention of the telegraph in the 19th century, radio and television in the 20th century, were perceived to be as revolutionary in their times as the changes we are seeing today. And questions about the consequences of the changes they would bring were asked then, as they are now. In fact, there's a wonderful little book called The Victorian Internet that describes how the telegraph threatened the future of newspapers, revolutionized commerce, and would create a whole new language. Sounds very familiar. People who pine for the times when the titans of journalism were individuals who only cared about the public good and were dedicated to fairness and balance are pining for a past that truthfully never existed. I make my living day in and day out with journalists. I follow very closely the editorial boards. I know many of the people who publish the newspapers. Their history is not the history that they like to make it look like. In fact, objective journalism in many cases, the objective journalism that we think we're losing today, is in truth a reality that has only existed to the extent that it has since the latter part of the 20th century. There are many who would even say that even during that part, the last 50 years or so, that objective journalism didn't exist. For those of you who can remember, or those who have studied, Richard Nixon, the silent majority. It was the silent majority that he felt reporters and the press were never speaking to or for. Beginning in our colonial period with the pamphleteers that predated newspapers and running well into the last century, newspapers were very much partisan organs that more often than not existed for the purpose to promote the political views and causes of their editors and party leaders, whether they were commenting on politics or business. They also existed and prospered, I might add, because they gave their readers what they wanted: a tinge of radicalism, conservatism, a call to arms, a cry to defend. By providing their consumers what they wanted to hear, the publishers became rich in both name and fortune. They created dynasties whose names today, Sulzberger, Pulitzer, Hearst, are both honored and very familiar. But the product they produced is not remembered, and it was anything but genteel. It looks very much like the news of today. You think Glenn Beck or Keith Olbermann are nasty? Go back to the days when these folks were the publishers, and you will see headlines that call political opponents prostitute wretches, tools of a baboon, blood-drinking cannibals. And that was, in many cases, friends who they were talking about. James Gordon Bennett, one of the great editors of the 19th century, quote, saw a public who would not buy a serious paper at any price, who had a vast and indiscriminate curiosity better satisfied with gossip than discussion, with sensation rather than fact, and who could be reached only through their appetites and passions. It sounds very much like the folks who are sitting in the rooms that I deal with as they try to decide what is basically a good news story and how to satisfy people and get them to focus on it. In fact, covering today's headlines on bankers' bonuses, CEOs, private planes, or activist investors would have been right up their alley. We worry and have concerns today about the future. We think about the 10 years from now, and you folks are going to live through it, and it's going to be a vital part of your futures. And we think about what the impact that journalism today is going to have on our markets, our regulation, our capitalism itself. What is a Rupert Murdoch or an Arianna Huffington going to do? How are they going to basically influence the world as we see it? But they had nothing on William Randolph Hearst, who spent 2 years using his New York Journal to promote war with Spain, a newspaper publisher promoting a war. And when it came, he ran a front-page editorial asking the world, how do you like the journal's war? He was so proud of it, he boasted of it. The world is not changing as much as we think, and the fears that we have are basically ones that we should put into context. Such are the forefathers, and frankly there were no foremothers, of American journalism. The recent measured tones of the New York Times or the Washington Post have been very much the exceptions to a rambunctious press, not part of the historic tradition. And we survived that. Our institutions adopted and adjusted to the processes that then exist to basically give us the vital marketplace that also coexisted at the time that this press existed. In fact, the Wild West atmosphere we ascribe to the internet and the excesses that are all too visible these days on cable TV are in many respects nothing more than a back to the future moment. Whether you like the way the news covers the capitalist system or not, the reality is that it is the way news, events, public policies, and markets are going to be covered in the future. And professors have a hard time when I say that, because everybody's ascribing to something that they think would be better. But that better has not existed in our history. What has existed is what we have today. Today, the external threat that has been created is actually the elimination of barriers to entry for those who want to and can tell us what is happening. It seems that everyone with a laptop today can and is a publisher, editor, reporter, and pundit, and the possibility is they can become famous based on not only 30 seconds, 15 seconds, but 5 seconds of having a nugget on Twitter that gets picked up by a couple of thousand people. In fact, the increased competition and the ability of consumers to find writers and publishers that get it creates not just an echo chamber of those who just want to see their beliefs proved true, it also has a profound impact on the business of journalism. The explosion of news sources has caused readers and viewers to desert mainstream media in droves. I'm sure you're studying that. The average weekday circulation of newspapers has been in a steady decline since the 1990s. TV news is in the same sinking boat. Today, the 3 major network news programs draw together the same size audience that the leading news broadcast attracted in the 1970s, approximately 25 million people. Now, if you sit with the anchor of NBC, what he will tell you over drinks is, it's still 25 million people. And there is no place else where you can get 25 million people to listen for 30 minutes. He's right, but it used to be almost triple that. That has precipitated a real economic crisis in the business. The departure of advertisers who in the end are very comfortable with not just reaching large audiences and demanding that, but want their promotions and insist that their promotions be seen next to non-controversial or unbiased news, something very difficult to do in today's world. But it's the consequences of journalism changes, not the causes, that I want to focus on, because the consequences do pose a threat that I think all of us have to take very seriously. In the age of information, it's hard to say that too much information and too many commentators are a bad thing. But in reality, you can have too much of a good thing. We're once a small group of gatekeepers that, in fairness, some people would protest as the so-called Eastern elite. They did speak with authority to the nation, and they did bestow credibility, even for those who disagreed, it was at least an argument point, on experts whose opinions made a difference. Today we have nothing more than a media free-for-all where every fact is allegedly worth of public airing and anyone's opinion is worthy of public consideration. We've commoditized the news, increasing its volume but decreased its value. We've reduced the respect of brands and people who spent decades building their credibility, and we have also reduced the credibility of the very news organizations that publish today. Technological advances and economic declines have dramatically shifted the power and influence of those who work in and with the media. As with other parts of our society, today the individual is ascendant. The institution is on the decline. It sounds good until you think, who's going to do the in-depth story about what it takes to rebuild a country like Haiti. No blogger has the ability to do that. No individual has the resources to fly there and develop. Nobody can gather all the facts. The clever blogger may have as much influence as a TV anchor. The Hollywood autism activist who can convince millions of Americans, for all good reasons in her own mind, not to have their children vaccinated, may have more impact than the head of a government health organization. In the increasingly competitive, economically challenged media world in which we now live, internet sites, television stations, even newspapers via their websites, scramble every second of every day to lure readers and viewers to their outlets and hold them with anything they think that will keep them reading, listening, and watching. To fill 24/7 broadcast or internet sites that lose readers' attentions if they don't keep refreshing their content, there's an insatiable need for media outlets to deliver new content, even when there are no new facts to report. In fact, today we manufacture controversies just so we can fill up an hour worth of news. We look for people to say something different just so we can print something to fill up the space that appears in the paper. Seizing upon this need, activists, and not just political, but economic, however you want to define them, are churning out an ever-expanding mountain of information in the hope that their musings, in some case ravings, depending on your point of view, will attract the attention of the mass media and thus influence the policy debates and choices that we as a people make with respect to market and economics policies. Long before the internet, television, or radio was invented, Mark Twain famously said that a lie can go around the world faster than the truth can put on their boots. The problem, I think, today is actually the opposite. In this world of high-speed technology and high-volume media platforms, outright lies are quickly refuted. They have no life to them, and they live on only in the fringes of the internet. It's the slivers of truth, not the whole story, but only that portion that meets the objectives of the storyteller, that actually today circle the globe instantaneously and create problems that never really go away. And most time, there is a sliver of truth. It's just, in many cases, not worth anything. With less time to produce their stories, fewer resources to devote to them, reporters at even the most elite news organizations increasingly do stories that are basically nothing more than he said, she said. Articles in which an accusation and a denial are all that's needed for a story. All too often, they don't have the time or the patience to ferry out the complicated truths, plural, behind every story. The effect that this has had on our both political and financial communications is damaging to both the participants and dangerous for our society. There's an old saying in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. But what choice do politicians and businesses have if the public is exposed to only one side of a story or carefully selected facts? And that's what bloggers, commentators, and news organizations do today to promote their particular theory. Not long ago, corporate communication departments of major businesses were largely devoted to putting out press releases about quarterly results or the hiring of a new senior executive or the opening of a new office in Kuala Lumpur. The media cared about the quality of your products, your sales, and your profits, but that was pretty much it. And frankly, that was wrong. It led to a lack of curiosity about how companies were building their businesses, about corporate social responsibility, and whether they were doing things in a way that people, their shareholders, would be proud of or not proud of. But today, in contrast, we have finally learned stories about how you treat your employees, what your corporate social responsibility program is, how you're dealing with your carbon footprint. All that is now part of it, and that's good. But in today's journalistic environment, the problem is that there is no context given to those stories, and that an accusation that is made about a company in any of those areas gets full publicity, regardless or not of whether a detailed understanding of the issue would later lead the reporter to believe that it was in fact worthy of the space they were giving it. There is no context any longer, and when you're paid by the word, as bloggers generally are, or you must incessantly file almost every half hour or hour to maintain your position in a major newsroom today, your ability to write context stories is, to say the least, limited. And to me, that's one of the biggest threats as we think over the next 10 years what journalism is going to be like. I deal with a constant deluge of questions, comments, or concerns about business, about political issues, about almost every issue that takes place in the world. And today, smart businesses who have to answer those questions, and we work on their behalf, maintain sophisticated political operations almost as good as the politicians who run for office every 2 years. They operate political-style war rooms that can operate 24/7 when they need to. Not because they want to, but because they have to. A company's reputation and brand today is on the line every minute, every day, and how they react and how they respond can determine whether a problem defines them. Toyota is the obviously classic case. It'll become the poster child for how your brand basically gets redefined when you have a crisis. Businesses are under constant scrutiny today, and the economic meltdown of the last 2 years ensures that the media is not going to let up anytime soon, if ever. So in a media world that is changing faster than Notre Dame football coaches, I was told I could get away with that quote, because I get on a plane in a couple hours. The question is, do we survive the threat of an insatiable beast that wants to know everything and will stop at nothing to get it? Happily, I think the answer is yes. I think the mainstream media, notwithstanding everything I said, is going to struggle and will likely wither. Online outlets, however, are going to continue to increase, and while the cacophony will only grow louder, there will be good information that's out there. I also think that television is going to suffer much greater than it currently does. I'm willing to bet that before the end of this decade, not one of the major broadcast networks will have a nightly 30-minute evening news program. The economics of the television news business just won't permit costly programs with only 5 million viewers to 10 million viewers to remain on the air. ABC just this week announced 300 layoffs in a group of just 1,700 people. Is this the end of the world? No. Big impact on my business, big impact to those people who want to be part of a public policy debate and really have an understanding, but not the end of the world. It's just the end of an era. None of the networks had a 30-minute news program before 1963. In fact, I think it's useful to consider all the changes taking place in the media now in the same way. It's not the end of the world, just the end of the era and one start of another. Newspapers and television media that have driven our national dialogue and provided a common language for communities across the nation and for the nation itself are less likely to exist as we go forward. USA Today, which was perceived as one of the great business successes of journalism just a few short years ago, is now mandating voluntary time off without pay. I'm not quite sure how you define voluntary time off without pay for all of their editorial staff. While the best of our media have long provided a continuing school of higher education, providing one-stop shops where people could learn what was going on, the so-called mass media had large audiences. The reality is today that is probably something that we will not see. We're going back to the past with the pamphleteers and people finding the information that they want to find. The information that we need, however, to make smart political and business choices is still going to be available. It's just going to have to be much more diligent, and you're going to have to be much more diligent in finding it. While the mass media circulation will shrink and in some cases disappear, we're going to put enormous pressure on our citizens to search through a variety of places to find out what is going on, to share common experiences, and then to speak a common language. All the things that mass media did for us in the past. And while the net's going to do a lot to keep us together, the net also allows people to find only the tribe that they're interested in and to only seek the information that their tribe is willing to discuss. That's something we're all going to have to fight again. Now, we can bemoan this change, but I'm quite optimistic about what it means for our nation, if not for individual news organizations. Because I'm in the information business, and therefore I believe that information at the end of the day is a good thing, and that our political and economic system has proven to be most successful and resilient in history when we have the greatest free flow of information. Information and ideas that exist in the public marketplace have always struggled to be heard from the inception of our republic, but they do get heard. Today, we look to the dysfunction of Washington and we shudder at the way we are governed. But I'm confident that notwithstanding how we look at them today, we're going to adjust to that new world, and we're going to adjust to a new world communication order. Good and bad journalists in the end have always existed. Sensational publications and sober outlets have always existed. Once again, we're going to have to go, though, to find them ourselves. There's not going to be what we have seen in the past, which is a national consensus and national publications. We're just simply in a volatile leg of human history in which we're going to find new ways to transmit information to more people. We've adjusted, in my sense, to all the revolutionary gadgets and changes in the past. I'm pretty sure that we're going to do it again. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to questions. So, Jim, it's all yours.
You spoke about the increase of information being a good thing, and I think that that's obvious, and we can agree on that. What do you think that the effect will be, though, on political, perhaps partisanship in this country? And is it a good thing?
Listen, it's as I said, it's hard for me to ever argue that information is not a good thing. But when we take a look at what's taking respect to partisanship now, I made my living many, many years ago and got into the corporate arena out of politics. It was pretty clear then that there were rules of debate, and there was some sense of who was speaking and who wasn't. Now, what that meant is a lot of people were excluded from the debate, and that was something that was wrong. But overall, there were still rules by which people would basically be able to get information. If you take a look at what has taken place today, we've lost the ability to gauge in debate as we used to think of it. Debate used to be about substance. Today, debate has more of a tendency to be about proving my point and only my point and being louder than the other side with respect to the point. We're no longer listening. It's the crucial issue. And most of the journalists who are out there recognize the problem. They're very concerned that when they put somebody on the air today or when they print somebody, that they're not sure that this person is a person in their mind of substance. But they do believe that if the person is a leader defined as somebody who has some type of following, that they have a necessity to actually give them some space. And so it's that problem that we're having. Nobody wants to be the gatekeeper and say, this person shouldn't be allowed to speak. But at the same time, nobody wants to say that this person's points really aren't relevant to the larger discussion that's taking place. And so that's where the system is sort of failing right now.
Just as a follow-up, I don't know if you were able to see the health summit.
Yep, I saw parts of it yesterday.
I was wondering, from the perspective of information, I mean, what do you think that, from the perspective of, like, the flow of information,
right,
what do you think that that meant?
I think it meant a lot. You know, I think what the president and the Republican Party managed to do was it's sort of similar to what they did in Maryland a couple of weeks ago, is they got it back from where it was, which was an extremism, which was both sides just shouting and frankly not talking. You can't have that. I mean, at the end of the day, Washington only works when there's compromise. In fact, it used to be considered a good thing. You sent people to Washington, frankly, to compromise, to create things, because the recognition was it took two sides to, basically make the party work. They basically now have once again reminded everybody that there is a discussion. You don't have to agree. And in fact, most people, I think, watching that yesterday came away convinced that if they agreed with the Republicans ahead before, they agreed with them at the end. If they agreed with the president before, they agreed with the president at the end. But I think from sending a message which is that debate is a good thing to take place and that there are ideas on both sides, whether we agree or not, that's a good thing. The impact it's had on the press, I will tell you, is tremendous. The press is befuddled by the whole thing. They actually feel that what has happened now is that the political system is reaching back in and trying to reassert some rules about how discourse is going to take place. Now, how successful that's going to be long term, I'm not sure. But I thought this was momentous. I actually think what took place in Maryland, maybe even more so, when the president addressed the House Republican congressional members, was truly a change in the dynamic of how discussions are taking place in Washington. And you're seeing that now. I mean, you are seeing now a more deliberate attempt to basically seem like you're listening and talking to the other side, even if you disagree. That's a good thing. I think it's a very good thing.
You mentioned that some journalists or media sources would sometimes make accusations against certain companies, which may be untrue or could be an extension of the truth, but nonetheless it gains full publicity. My question for you is, what's the best way for a business to respond to such a situation, just so that they can keep and maintain their reputation?
Well, one, we have to recognize that the world right now is fascinated by the word transparency. And so everybody wants everything to be transparent. Now, there's a great Supreme Court justice in New York State who once said, two things you should never see: sausage making and legislation. So transparency has been taken away a little bit. And you know, I speak to a lot of schools, and you know, I know it's like the worst thing to say that you don't want to be transparent. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just saying it's been confused. What most people really want is a free flow of information and answer to their ideas, to their questions. And so when a crisis takes place for a company right now, I don't think most people really care specifically what the internal deliberations of the company are. They all recognize that someplace there's a PowerPoint presentation that more likely and not is going to be embarrassing, and some lawyer is going to be able to stand up and show it and demonstrate that it basically affects people's values, or as a demonstration of values. Most people say, wait a second, it's probably one document out of 300,000. Does that really purport to show what it shows? In a crisis today, what people want to know is the following. A, are you fixing it, first and foremost? B, what did you do when it first came to your attention? So what's your values? And C, how are you handling the people who were hurt? If you can do those three things, more likely than not, you're going to survive the crisis, assuming you did it right. As soon as you heard, you took the right steps, you did everything you could to fix the problem, and your value structure, therefore, was the right value structure. You know, you look at some of the crises today, and we've all been shaken. I mean, some of the internal ways companies have handled some of the problems that the world has seen, everything from child labor overseas to the recent problem with, you know, Toyota in the cars, raises questions. And that's why those brands get damaged. But those are the three things that most companies have to answer.
I'm curious about whether you could speak to the business model, and it concerns me. I saw a survey this morning from a publication called PR News that says that most people receive their local news from a newspaper website. I also received a note from a friend in my hometown, the town I grew up in out in Montana, that said the last radio newsman in my hometown died last week. There is no radio news. So people obviously aren't getting it from radio. Many of them seem to be getting local news from newspaper websites. But if a newspaper is giving it away on the website, how do they stay in business? How do they make money?
You got two issues going on right now. I was recently at a dinner with a couple of the publishers of some of the major business magazines, and they were talking basically, it was about 8 of us, what's the future? And they were all trying different things. You got a couple of things that are taking place right now, which is alarming, I think, for all of us, actually, at a certain point. One is there is no business model right now that anybody can figure out by which newspapers can continue in their present format. At the end of the day, we're not seeing advertisers willing to, frankly, step up to the plate and buy ads in publications because they think they are local. What we're seeing advertisers say, as they have always said in the past, I buy ads because I think the audience is the audience I want. And newspapers still think that somehow advertisers are going to step up to the plate because it's a public imperative for them to do that. So one, you don't have advertisers doing anything but saying, do you have the audience or don't you have the audience? And two, the audience is declining because everybody, and that's an exaggeration, but a tremendous amount of people are getting the news now online. Many people are walking away from just general mass circulation papers anyway because they don't want to spend the time on it. Others are doing it because the web enables them to basically just pull the stories that they're interested in. But at the end of the day, as long as newspapers are willing to put their content online, which they are right now, it's sort of, you know, they're eating their own. They're giving away something for free, and they're puzzled why people therefore aren't going to the newsstand and paying $2 to buy it into place. So newspapers are destroying themselves. I mean, they are losing audience because people are less interested to a certain extent in what they're doing in the general mass circulation mind of covering everything. And they're also getting hurt because they're putting their content on the web for free and have not yet figured out a way to charge for that ability. What the newspapers will tell you is they think they're doing this because people will advertise online, and that will make up for the loss of the paid circulation. There's no proof of that. I basically am responsible for a large amount of advertising dollars that get spent in the United States in some fashion or other. There is no proof of that. We have seen no evidence that the online media will ever make up for the total amount of paid circulation that used to exist from an advertiser's mentality. So I think in the end what you're going to have is the following. You're going to have some newspapers that just become so local that they will do nothing more but to, cover the local story, and they will try to get the local store, and they will only have a newsroom that basically is paid for in that fashion. Very small newsroom, a lot of volunteer news. And then on the other side of the coin, you're going to have one or two probably major circulation papers, perhaps the New York Times, Wall Street Journal being those types of models, that may be able to still be national newspapers of renown and have newsrooms, but they're going to lose all the ability they used to have, which is to have a lot of foreign bureaus and everything else, because there's just not enough money to support them either. The third process that's taking place is things like ProPublica. You're seeing, which is so-called not-for-profit organizations being set up to set up and do news. Those not-for-profit news publications are being supported by wealthy philanthropists. And so there is also some hope that in the end they will take the place of the newspapers as we know them today and that basically do the hard-hitting news. I'm not sure yet that we've seen any philanthropists who are willing to endow that for the long term in such a way that it's basically going to be a workable business model. So I'm a pessimist. I mean, I will tell you, I don't see newspapers long-term surviving.
Endow it and leave it alone.
Right, right. I mean, I think what you're going to have is you've always had, some philanthropists, quote unquote, who want to have a news bureau that basically reflects their views. That will always continue. There are always wealthy people who like that. But when we start talking about a news as we think about it, which is unbiased, bringing to the front and foremost major issues, that's unlikely to take place. I think you folks in particular are going to have issues in the future about where you get your information. I think it's pretty clear that the traditional sources are going to slowly but surely disappear. And the likelihood of your being able to find broad range information is going to be slim. So it's going to require people then to understand the biases of the people who are writing the publications that you do receive. And that's going to get tougher and tougher as we go forward. But I'm a pessimist about newspapers, even more a pessimist about magazines. There's no proof yet that there is enough of a mass circulation audience left that basically is interested in keeping those things alive. And advertisers are not going to do it. Yes?
Hello, sir. Good morning.
Morning.
So I have two questions, actually. A couple of weeks ago, I read somewhere that New York Times is actually going to start charging its customers for viewing the news online.
Right.
So the first question is, do you anticipate other publications doing the same? And number two, given the changes in the media industry, where do you foresee the potential for careers now, especially for those here that are interested in developing a career in media?
All right, well, let's start with the New York Times first. The New York Times has been struggling for several years now with trying to figure out why it is the greatest source of news on the web with the largest clicks per news story of any possible publication and can't make enough money based on that to actually enhance their position. And the obvious answer is because they give it away for free. I mean, at the end of the day, sitting with them is sort of baffling. They have watched the Wall Street Journal for years charge $99 to $139 per subscription for online news. Be successful, not get a lot of money, but get those $99 and $139 enough that it basically will support the newsroom to a certain extent. The New York Times has been afraid to do that. And I suspect what you have there is the New York Times is a paper of influence. And part of its influence is because it does have more clicks per story than any other publication out there. And I think it's afraid that it'll go from 2 million people reading it online, 700,000 reading it in actual circulation to potentially only X amount of people online, and it will lose its so-called position of primacy. And that's an issue that I think the Times internally will never say it confronts, but nothing else makes sense. Otherwise, they've just been in a position where they've given away for free what the Journal for years has charged and have not been able to show any advertising dollars that have made up for that. So they're going to experiment with it. We'll see what happens. They're still not willing to say, we're just going to put a gate up. What they're saying is certain stories will have a charge. We'll see how it all works out. I think they have to cross the Rubicon and admit that what they publish is worth people paying for. I actually think it is, but they have to come to that grip. The second story question is, what's the future? The future is actually good if you don't want to be a journalist and you want to be a media. Today, everybody can publish. I employ almost 5,000 people in the end of the day who are involved in some respects or other with the media. The reality is, a few short years ago, we were probably 1,000, and a few short years before that, we were probably 200-300. The truth of the matter is, the media field is expanding at a tremendous pace, and the opportunity for anybody who wants to be in that field is clearly there. But if you want to be a journalist on the other side, the reality is that space is shrinking. So to go back to Jim's point, there are no more radio journalists. TV journalists are slowly but surely disappearing, apropos the ABC News announcement this week of a shrinkage of 300 to 400 people in their department. So I think what you're going to see is firms like public relations firms like Octagon, sports marketing and sponsorship firms, will expand and will supply information to the world. The danger for that is, when we supply information, we're propagandists. When you go to work for us, you're paid to basically put out a position, hopefully a truthful position, one with integrity, one you can believe in, one that you basically have no problem speaking, but you're a propagandist. And in the old days, what I counted on is when we put out that information, or our people did, the news editors served, or the reporters served, as a filter. And then the public made their own analysis of what the information was based on that. Today, when we do that, there is no filter anymore. We are, in essence, self-publishing. And therefore, we have to be more careful about what we say, because even though we continue in our role as propagandists, we have to be aware that people now receive our information directly. And so there's even more import for us to make sure that our accuracy is there and that our suggestive talents are being used in a way that doesn't go over the line. So I think the opportunity is great if you want to be a media, but it's not going to be the old Woodward-Bernstein type of media jobs that are basically going to exist. It's more likely going to be the media jobs on our side of the house that's going to exist. Yes? It's the most well-behaved audience I've ever been in.
You mentioned that media organizations were having a hard time finding news stories to either put in print or put on TV. But with everything going on in the world, why don't they just choose to report the news?
I'm sorry, why don't they?
Why don't they just report some of the important stories that are on the news that are happening in the world?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? You broke up a little bit.
With everything going on in the world, why do the news organizations that we have today have such a hard time just reporting some of the serious events that we see?
Well, here's a classic example. Haiti takes place. It takes place. It's a terrible, devastating thing. Over the course of that weekend, for those of you who are following the news, the stories were twofold. One was the tragedy that took place in Haiti, and second was what was the response. Now, anybody in the business of media would have said that makes sense. The demands by the media to fill the 24 hours got very tough because after a certain period of time, all they could show was the horror and devastation that was taking place. So they needed other stories and then immediately began to focus on, is the government providing what it said it was going to provide? Are companies coming to the forefront with respect to programs that they were suggesting they were going to do? So there was suddenly a shift in the news from the horror and tragedy to the process, and that's what generally takes place. Now, normally that would be okay, but in a 24-hour news cycle that never ends, and with 24 hours of cable television to fill, and with 24 hours of internet stories to file, it became a feeding frenzy to a certain extent of the same constant repetitive story. And so it's not till 3 weeks later that we start to read stories about it's more than just Haiti. It's actually Istanbul. It's more than just Istanbul. It's actually almost every developed nation, every recently developing city that was built once for a couple of 100,000 people, and in today's world is urbanized and has anywhere from 3 to 10 million people living in it, and doesn't have any of the type of strictures on how buildings should be built. That's the story that in the past would be more likely one that people would have focused on, which is what's the meaning of the event beyond just the horror of the event. But with a 24-hour constant need to fill pictures, space, stories, we dwell on the process stories. And that's where one of the problems is right now, because at a certain point, people either tune out or they just hear the superficial. And they don't really get to the context story that we used to get. Now, I don't want to overstate it, because that context story that I just said was recently covered by 2 major publications. But it took a couple of weeks for them to basically get there. In the past, they would have probably started to write the who, what, when, where story almost on day one. But now what we really want is the terrible horror stories. We're more likely to look for the alarmist stories than we are for the context stories. So that's why I'm a borderline optimist, because the story was written. It just took a long time before people started to focus on the story that should have been written almost on day one. I should say also that we've provided a lot of that resource assistance to the U.S. government with respect to how to handle those issues. Yes.
I feel like I'm kind of, I don't know, dominating the questions here, but you
Two
talked
questions
about,
doesn't let you dominate.
all right, fair enough. But you talked about the demise perhaps of foreign agencies and how media is being commoditized. What I wonder is, do individuals have the perspective to report on world events and, I don't know, compare? So are we going to lose the absolute depth? Even if we do get a bunch of information kind of horizontally, are we going to lose kind of the vertical part of the story that would be able to, I don't know, compare between countries and everything else?
It's the biggest issue that journalists are actually talking about today, and journalist schools are talking about, which is what's the institutional ability to actually develop stories. Bloggers can't do it. I mean, there's somehow a belief that just blogging and a whole bunch of people blogging basically will unveil all the news that's necessary on an event, and that citizen journalism, which is being defined that way, is basically going to fulfill the need that newspapers used to do. You will get the person who's angry at the town council meeting to blog about what happened at the town council meeting once. You might get them twice. You might even get them 3 times. If they're a normal, rational person, the likelihood of them wanting to do that the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th time without getting paid for it is probably questionable. And the willingness for them to spend the in-depth hours that a paid reporter in a local newspaper used to do, because they was paid to do that, is also unlikely to take place. So I think we're less likely, the so-called citizen journalism movement, while it has some great moments because it unveils some of the problems that otherwise would not get the light of the day, it in no way has the resources to one day supplant what newspapers have traditionally done and news bureaus have traditionally done. So I think there's a real danger here. I think actually in a world where everybody thinks we're going more transparent, there's a good chance that as institutional news machines disappear, it will be very surface, because the actual digging of stories will slowly but surely disappear, because that requires not just skill, citizen journalists can have that, but it requires time, it requires effort. There's no example yet where that is going to, that I know of, where that's going to happen. In fact, some of the greatest citizen journalism stories that take place today get written about by the mainstream press. You know, somebody uncovers something, brings it to the mainstream press, and then the mainstream press follows up. Well, if the mainstream press, identified as a local paper, disappears, there's nobody to do that anymore. And I think that's more likely to what happens. So on that area, that's one of the danger points that's taking place, is if we don't support local publications, local news bureaus in some fashion or other, there is a danger that we will lose the ability to look for stories and to get deep stories. I think it's more likely that that's already happening in certain cities. You know, when you go back to years ago, bad stories in one town, one newspaper stories, weren't written. Everybody was sort of pals with each other. And then, you know, sort of major, you know, newspapers got more professionalized. They started covering it. They distanced themselves from the political apparatus. They distanced themselves from the company. That's unlikely to take place. You know, you'll have some citizen journalists, but I think that's more of a danger. So I don't want to be misconstrued. I actually think that is a danger that's out there. And again, we don't have a mechanic yet to replace that. That's why Steiger, who used to be the editor of the Wall Street Journal, is now the head of ProPublica, which is a philanthropy-endowed investigative journalism group that has 20 journalists. And he's going to see whether or not he can, you know, sort of replicate what used to exist in the major news bureau. I'm not sure Paul will be successful, but that's where the belief is coming from to do that. Yes?
Hi. In this case, would a model such as the BBC's model of public financing to this type of media, of journalism coverage be a solution to this problem?
You know, that's the question. But the danger with that is, and I speak as an American, but one who operates overseas, the concept of government funding of news is chilling. And when we look at the BBC, and many of us held the BBC up for many years as a model of so-called nonpartisan news, the BBC's track record over the last 5 years has been anything but. It's been accused of having biased stories on everything from the Israeli-Palestinian issue to the coverage of Blair and the Iraq War, to local events that they also do. And I think what you have is, in the end, questions when government financing takes place. We can take a look. I was just over in Moscow, and I met with some of the folks there in some of their news bureaus, and, you know, Pravda, you know, government supported, you know, today discredited, but coming back. As people slowly look at it, you go over to China. The news is still fundamentally, I would be careful in how I would present it, but it is carefully following a government line. But at the same time, China right now has the greatest amount of bloggers of any country in the world, and a relatively free, in some respects, internet process whereby people are communicating to each other. Now, I'm not talking about the Google issue and some of the others. I'm just saying that people have access to an internet and they are communicating. So there are all these different types of models out there, but the concept of government funding sends a shudder through me, because no matter how much we say that the government will not intrude in the news process or the editorial process, it's impossible to believe. In this country, years ago, there was almost a consensus that there should be funding of the arts, because there was a fear that if we didn't fund the arts, who would fund the arts? Today, it's considered one of the greatest political battles that takes place, because the funders of the arts fund something that one side or the other side doesn't like. And so there's no ability to basically have sort of a distancing from the decision-making process in people's minds. So I'm skeptical about government funding, and I suspect in the BBC there's a strong movement in that country to do away with the license arrangement by which the government, by which people actually support the BBC. The way it works, for those of you who don't know, is every time you buy a television in the UK, you pay a license fee, and that license fee goes to the BBC. In the most recent budget that the UK government put up, it was questionable whether or not that was going to pass. The BBC almost got defunded, and I think it's questionable if they will be funded 5 years from now when it comes up again, because of dissatisfaction with that issue.
How is government financing of the news any worse than being propagandaist, as you stated?
Because I'm not paid by the taxpayer. I'm not a politician who's basically being paid by the public to be unbiased. I'm being paid by a corporation to put out news on a product, to help enhance a brand, to improve a reputation. So I understand that distinction, and I do, when I work in those areas, I feel comfortable with that. So I can be basically a biased advocate on behalf of the person who's paying me. If the government was paying with me, I think we would all question that.
But is it fair for media outlets to tout themselves, for instance, as fair and balanced, when, in fact, admittedly, they're being paid by a corporation to slant?
Well, you know, when you look at that, let's take that because it's a great argument. I would have the same problem with fair and balanced. I think it was a brilliant thing for them to take on years ago, but I should tell everybody in this room, I mean, Indiana, I'm not sure where you guys are anymore. I'm a lifetime Democrat. But at the end of the day, when you take a look at how that news is being broadcast, that's not because a corporation is paying for Fox to do it. It's not because the advertisers on that want Fox to have a political bias. I would tell you, dealing with the advertisers, they're nervous. They think Glenn Beck and Keith Olbermann are problematic. They think they potentially both could step over the line, and they don't want their ads to show there. I would say Fox, as a business corporation, has basically taken a position that that type of advocacy news actually makes sense for them because they're attracting a large audience. Is that good for America? Separate question. I would also tell you, though, MSNBC on the left is basically trying to do almost the exact same thing. So, but it's not outside corporations. We have to be careful when we think that there are some type of outside corporate groups who have united to do this. That's not what's taking place. Fox is trying to make money. NBC is trying to make money. They're taking a position in the marketplace where they think they attract viewers. If they attract viewers, they hope to attract advertisers. That's what's taking place. Okay, got you with the Democrat line, eh?
Well, the follow-on question to the one you were just answering is, from the Pentagon Papers case, right, the Supreme Court decision basically decided that case in part because an informed and educated public is necessary for the functioning of our democracy. So given what you've just said in that response, whither our democracy? And what would you advise these students in the room to do going forward in order to be citizens in our democracy?
It's what I started the speech by saying. I'm worried about it. But I think the right answer is not to shut it down, because we don't have a good model. I don't buy the BBC model. I don't buy the Pravda model. I don't buy the government model. I question the philanthropist model. So until somebody comes up with a better model, we've got a model right now where private enterprise owns the news. We had a short period of time where I think the news sought to have an image of being unbiased. The last 50 years or so, I think we're going back to the past where that was not true. But the way they did it in the past was they were skeptical. You knew when you read somebody's paper what the perspective of that paper was. You understood why you were buying it, either because you agreed with it or disagreed with it, because it made you angry or because it made you happy. But you sought the news and understood where you were buying it. We're going back to that again. And I think we have to just recognize, you got to be smart enough to recognize who the purveyor of the news is. And you have to accept that the news today has more of a tendency to not seek to be unbiased, to not seek to present both sides of the view. The danger to me is, the sad thing is, will we have a news that is willing to cover what the President and Republican Party did yesterday? Now there we have a mandate by government where they can seize the airwaves and basically force the networks to show that in exchange for the networks getting free access to the airwaves. But you can't do that with a town council meeting. You can't do that with a zoning issue. You can't do that when a company does something wrong and it's a local paper that used to cover it. That's the fear I have. So, I think it's going to be incumbent upon everybody to recognize the skepticism when they read it, but still to seek it. And the smartest are going to say, I need to hear both sides, and they're going to have their TVs programmed both ways. You're going to watch Rachel Maddox, and you're going to watch O'Reilly. And it's going to be as simple as that, because if you don't, you're going to miss part of the debate. And if you miss part of the debate, you're not going to be informed.
So if people don't really have time to devote to watching both sides of the debate, are they going to be willing to pay for it, like the New York Times is suggesting, or Rupert Murdoch said all online content will be paid for? Will people be willing to do that? And if not, what are the new advertising models then that people are discussing to move forward?
It's not advertising. This is the frustrations people have. It's not advertising's job to be a public utility. That's a myth, okay? I mean, the reality is TV was created. I think you know that based on your classes. What's TV's real business medium? It's to deliver advertising. It's not to deliver entertainment. It's to deliver advertising. What were newspapers originally created for? To deliver advertising. That was their business model. Okay, and then they wrapped around it, news and everything else that people wanted to read. But it was to deliver the advertising. We're never going to get to a world, I don't think, where advertising thinks it's in their, or corporations think it's their duty to basically advertise in these places to promote TV or news entities. So as long as that's going to take place, and I'm pretty sure that's going to take place, you're not going to see advertisers stepping up on what they think is not economically smart grounds to actually advertise someplace. The answer is going to be you're going to have to reach into your pocket for that buck. Because if you don't recognize what it means, not only won't you know the terms of the debate, you're not even going to have a vote in it. You're not going to be counted when people call. You're not going to be part of the decision-making process. Now, what that could mean in its worst case, and this was recently a subject of a seminar that took place at another business school, is the elites will once again rise to the top because they're going to be the only ones who are actually going to be getting the information. And other people who are not getting information because it only cost a quarter to get the sports scores in the past. So when you paid the paper for the quarter, you got the sports scores, but you also got the first couple of pages. And so you got some sense of the news. Now you just go online, you get it for free, and you just get the sports score, no news. There's a chance that only the elites are going to actually get into conversation. That's dangerous for our democracy. That's incredibly dangerous for our democracy. But I think you're going to have to reach into your pocket for the buck. There's no other way to do it. There's no mandated methodology by which I can come up with that's going to do it. For my business, that's okay. Because at the end of the day, we will create social media sites, we will create engagement processes by which, on behalf of our clients, we'll get people in some respect or other to try a product, to think about a brand, to reflect on a reputation. But the important issue is the news. That's not necessarily as proven to me. And so you're going to have to do it. And I have a problem when people say they don't have enough time to read a newspaper. I don't get it. What else? I'm a news junkie, but, how do you participate in the world's democracy if you don't follow the events that are taking place? And they don't just happen every 2 years. So, to me, that's just an obligation of citizenship. Yes?
You mentioned with the current media landscape that a company's reputation is truly on the line every minute of every day. What are some of the steps you would recommend that companies can take internally or tactically to be able to manage this reality?
Well, first they have to recognize that. And so that's the first thing. It's, sort of like the 12-step process, which is you have to come to grips with where you are. And so the first thing is you have to say, you know what, I'm a public figure as a corporation today. Just like an elected official. I have an image, and therefore, more likely than not, I have to participate and give people some sense as to what that image stands for. So companies have to give people a sense of what they stand for. Some say corporate social responsibility, which I gather from something I read last night, some of you are being taught about right now, is just a good thing to do because it's good PR. Corporate social responsibility is a good thing to do because it's a good thing to do. And your employees generally really like it when you are a good company doing good things. So second is stand for something. Do good things. Most good corporations today try to do that. And then the third thing is be willing to promote what you're doing. So what companies have to do today is they have to flesh out who they are, and what they stand for. It's not enough to just say you have a product. You have to have an image behind that product. Now, different companies do it different ways. Nike obviously has an image. It attracts people who want to buy its product because of the sense of activism that it gives to people who wear the slash. Apple has a different image. It's all about innovation. It's all about being cutting edge. It's all about being part of the new world. Different companies are going to have different ones. And then behind that, they have all types of programs to flesh out whatever that image and brand that they want. That's what companies have to do today. And then the moment they get in trouble, and every company gets in trouble at some moment or time, every company does something wrong at some moment. If you have more than one employee, somebody, someplace, somewhere is doing something wrong at some moment in time. If you have a product, someplace, somewhere, it's failing. Every company does something wrong. If you do the other things right, which is let people know what you stand for, let your own employees know that you have a value system, and let people understand what your products are all about as far as what they're trying to accomplish, that inevitable day when you do something wrong, you'll be able to draw upon the good stuff you've done, the image stuff you've done, to basically get a benefit of the doubt. And that benefit of the doubt is really what you want on that 1 minute when they make that phone call, which is, Toyota actually got that in a funny way. The initial response was, Toyota's not a company where you expect to have engineering problems. That their image was that wasn't their problem. So there was some sense, I'm not sure another company would have had as much time as they seemingly had to solve their problem, because they had that image. That's how companies have to do it. They have to build an image to themselves.
It seems that some of these smaller outlets, like the Twitters or the blogs that you kind of touched on, have become one of the major competitors for even the big networks and the major outlets of news that seem to be in so much trouble. How do you see these major outlets trying to capitalize on that, if at all?
Well, two things. One is we got to not confuse the technology, which the major outlets must capture. I mean, the reality is the printing press is dead to a certain extent. We're all getting our media a different way now, or we will as time continues. So all the major outlets have to do that, but we can't confuse that. Twitter, actually, interesting enough, tends to be still a medium that tends old rather than young. It's not yet clear that it's going to actually be the medium that people think it's going to be, and it yet hasn't shown any type of business model that is going to basically become important. And I think if you're basically a major reporter, you really question whether or not 140 characters are good enough to summarize a story. They're good enough as an ad for a story, but they're not good enough for a story. But I think what the major media is going to have to do, it's going to have to recognize that today's whole world is all about engagement. It's all about trying to figure out a way by which people can pull the news they want to pull. And most of the major publications are trying to do that. So they're playing with the technology. I don't think that's their issue. Their issue really is in a world where they used to have large circulation and advertisers who were interested in that circulation, that large circulation is disappearing and it's fragmenting. And therefore advertisers are no longer willing to pay the premium that they used to pay to be part of that. And so that's their real problem right now. It's a business model problem as much as it is a readership problem. I think a lot of them, the New York Times being the example, it would probably happily publish to the 700,000 people who buy it, but the 2 million people who read it digitally. I think that would probably, in normal cases, they would think that's a tremendous success. The problem is it's a failure as a business model. They can't make enough money to support what they have to do to produce that news. But as a viewership model, they never envisioned that there would one day be close to 3 million readers daily reading the New York Times. That just was not true in the past, and they probably never envisioned it being true in the future. But that's where they are. So it's a business model problem. And we have not yet found any replacement for advertising, and we know, to your point, that people are not yet willing to pay enough digitally, or we don't think they're willing to pay enough digitally. Now, the Journal went a very different way. They're actually thinking that they might be very successful charging, and in fact, they are continuing to increase their charges and look for additional ways to charge for what they call premium content. The FT, for those of you who read the Financial Times, has also gone to a gated system where they are charging. The issue is going to be, those are both business publications, and therefore there's some sense that you must have that news if you're in the business community and or if you're involved in the markets. The question will be whether the New York Times can do it, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and frankly, your own local papers. That's where the problem is. Well, thank you.